Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we dig into, well, all sorts of sources, articles, research, our own notes, basically anything we can get our hands on to pull out the key insights for you. We always aim to get you well informed pretty quickly, hopefully with some surprising stuff and maybe just enough humor to keep things interesting. Today, we're heading into quite a mystery. One of history's most enduring, really perplexing enigmas. It's just a piece of linen, but it has this faint, kind of haunting image of a crucified man. We are, of course, talking about the Shroud of Turin. It's this artifact that, gosh, for centuries has captivated scholars, scientists, the public, sparking debates that go way beyond just believing or not believing. It's truly one of the most baffling items out there, a real paradox. So our deep dive today is going to be just that, taking a really close look at all the complex layers of evidence around the shroud. We want to try and move past simple yes or no answers and really dig into the competing scientific claims, the historical angles, the medical stuff. Our goal isn't just to list the evidence, but to understand why. Why does this thing continue to defy easy answers?
Why is it still such a profound mystery? And to do that, we'll be pulling together information from, well, a really diverse range of places. You've got the big scientific studies like the Shroud of Turin Research Project. People usually call it STIRRB. Then there are historical documents, forensic analyses, the ongoing academic arguments. It's a pretty unique chance to see how all these different fields, science, history, medicine, kind of crash into each other over this one single object. For me, just the fact that this mystery persists, how it keeps challenging what we think we know about science and history, it's just endlessly fascinating. I'm really keen for us to unpack these scientific puzzles and the historical twists.
It really is a compelling journey we're setting out on for us and for you listening. And as we go through this, I think it's a great chance for, well, some real critical thinking. We'll be looking at how all these different areas of knowledge, material science, chemistry, forensic medicine, ancient history, how they all converge on this one single artifact. It's quite a case study, actually. It makes you ask fundamental questions about, what is evidence? How do we interpret it? And gosh, how tricky is it when different findings seem to completely contradict each other? This isn't just about listing facts. It's about the whole process of trying to figure things out.
Okay, let's dive right in then. The image on the shroud. That's got to be the most mysterious part, right? When you first see pictures, maybe you think, oh, it's a painting or maybe some kind of drawing. But when scientists really took a close look, it turned out to be much, much more complicated. So what is it? What makes this image so fundamentally different from, well, anything else we've seen? What are these unique properties that make it such a scientific head-scratcher?
Well, that's exactly it. The scientific investigations, especially that big push by Stirp back in 1978, they uncovered several unique physical and chemical properties about this image that are, frankly, unparalleled. There's really nothing else like it. First off, there's what they call its extreme superficiality. And this is absolutely critical. The image doesn't really soak into the cloth, not at all. It sits only on the absolute topmost microfibers of the linen threads.
Only the very top. Like, how thin are we talking?
We're talking incredibly thin, like the very outer layer of the fibers themselves, maybe 200 to 600 nanometers thick. That's thinner than a human hair. And the color itself, it isn't from something applied like paint or dye. It's actually a chemical change within the linen's cellulose structure itself. It's a process involving oxidation, dehydration, and conjugation of the cellulose. And the result is this sort of straw yellow discoloration.
Okay, so the linen itself changed the color right on the surface.
Exactly. And why that's so significant is it immediately rules out conventional paints or dyes. Those would soak into the fabric, through capillary action. If you spill coffee on a tablecloth, right, it wicks into the fibers, makes a blurry stain. That's not what happened here. The image just sits right on the surface, almost like a very, very subtle chemical scorch or tan.
So it's like the linen was tanned or maybe subtly burned from within rather than having something put on it. And following from that, I understand they couldn't find any paint or pigment either.
Right.
Which seems really weird for, say, a medieval artwork. How thorough were those tests? Could an artist have used something really faint, something we just missed today?
That's a fair question, and the Stirp team was incredibly thorough. They threw a whole battery of tests at it: X-ray fluorescence, infrared tomography, microchemical tests, spectroscopy, loads of techniques available back then. And their conclusion was pretty definitive. Expensive testing found absolutely no evidence of paint, pigments, dyes, or stains that could actually form the image. They weren't just looking for typical artist stuff. They were looking for any foreign material that could explain the image.
But didn't one researcher find something?
Yeah.
Like iron oxide or something?
Ah, yes, you're thinking of Walter McCrone. He did claim to find microscopic bits of red ochre and vermilion, and he argued it was basically a painting. But the vast majority of these other STURP scientists, and remember, this was a big multidisciplinary team doing independent checks, they concluded these particles weren't evenly spread across the image. Where they did find them, the amounts were so tiny, really minuscule, that they couldn't possibly account for the whole image. The consensus was they were probably just contaminants. Maybe from centuries of handling dust or maybe even pigment particles floating around in churches where it was kept, settling on the cloth over time. So the key takeaway, the really crucial insight, is that the image itself isn't made of paint or dye or any discernible substance applied to it. And that's where it gets really interesting, because it completely challenges how you'd normally think about making an image, especially back then. How would you even forge something like that?
Right. And then there's that other discovery, even before STURP, way back in the 1890s, the photographic thing. That seems totally out of place for something potentially medieval.
Oh, absolutely. That was Secondo Pia in 1898. He was an Italian photographer, one of the pioneers, and he got permission to take the first photos of the shroud. What he found in his darkroom was just astounding, a total shock. He discovered the image on the shroud has the properties of a photographic negative.
Meaning light and dark are flipped.
Exactly. The light and dark areas are inverted from what you see with the naked eye. So when he developed his photographic plates, he didn't just get a clearer version of the faint image on the cloth. He suddenly saw this incredibly clear, vivid, realistic, positive image of a man with normal light and shadow. This was just revolutionary. No ordinary painting or drawing behaves like that. Even early photos didn't quite work that way. How could a medieval artist possibly have understood, let alone created, something with negative photographic properties? It's like stumbling on a photograph centuries before photography was invented.
And maybe even more mind-bending than the negative property is the 3D information. When I first read about that, it completely shifted how I saw the shroud. Can you break that down? Because I think it's really key.
It's probably one of the most unique and baffling properties.
Yeah.
Critical piece of the puzzle. Basically, the intensity, how dark the image is in any given spot, it directly relates to the distance between the cloth and whatever body it might have wrapped. So in the late 1970s, some scientists, including guys from NASA actually, used this machine called a VP8 image analyzer. It was originally designed for things like mapping the moon, turning variations in light intensity into 3D relief maps.
Okay.
So they fed the shroud image data into this VP8, and instead of getting a distorted mess, which is what you'd get if you put a normal photograph in there.
Right, because a photo is flat.
Exactly. A photo just records light and shadow on a flat plane. It doesn't encode depth in its pixel intensity. But the shroud image, it produced this stunningly clear, coherent, three-dimensional relief map of the man's body. Think about that. Darker areas on the shroud correspond to points closer to the body, lighter areas to points farther away. This property is it's unprecedented for any known image, natural or man-made, before modern digital imaging. It's almost like the image was made for a technology that wouldn't exist for another century and a half. It's mind-bending, like you said.
And one more thing, a subtle point, but about how the color actually got onto the fibers. It's not directional. Is that right?
That's right. The property of non-directionality. If you look at a brushstroke, you can often see the direction the artist moved their hand, right? Or if you did a rubbing, you'd apply pressure from a certain angle. But with the shroud image, there's no discernible directionality at all. That straw yellow discoloration seems to be applied to the individual linen fibers equally from all angles. No streaks, no smudges, no sign of anything being brushed or scraped on in a specific direction. This just adds another layer of difference from any known artistic technique.
Wow. Okay, so let's recap. Extreme superficiality, just the very top. No paint or pigment. It acts like a photographic negative. It has 3D information built into the image intensity. And there's no directionality.
That's the package deal, yeah. An unprecedented combination. And the insight here isn't just that it's unusual, it's so fundamentally different from any known natural or artistic process that it really forces us to question how images can even be formed. It sort of defies our current understanding.
So if it's not a painting, not a simple scorch, not a photograph as we know it, what are the main ideas about how this image could have possibly formed? Because obviously something created these incredibly specific, seemingly impossible markings.
Exactly. And its sheer uniqueness has led to a lot of theories, all trying to make sense of these really strange characteristics. We can group them, maybe. Let's start with the ones that lean towards, a non-artificial or maybe even miraculous origin. People often call these radiation-based theories. The basic idea here is that maybe some kind of burst of energy could be a corona discharge, like a faint electrical glow, or maybe low-energy proton radiation, or even a neutron flux, a burst of subatomic particles. Maybe this energy shot out from the body when the image was formed.
Like a flash of energy.
Sort of, yeah. An intense, sudden burst that essentially scorched the cloth, but only at a microscopic level, creating the image. Now, the pros for this idea are pretty strong. An energy burst could potentially explain the extreme superficiality, the energy hitting just the surface. It could maybe account for the 3D information if the intensity fell off with distance from the body. And it could explain the specific chemical change in the linen fibers, that oxidation dehydration thing. For a lot of people, this fits very well with the idea of a miraculous event like the resurrection, where you might imagine some kind of divine energy being released.
Okay, I see the appeal, but what are the downsides?
Well, the downsides are huge, scientifically speaking. These theories are completely speculative. Right now, we know of absolutely no natural way for a human body, dead or alive, to emit that specific kind of radiation at that intensity to make an image like this. So to make it work, you either have to invoke a supernatural event, which, by definition, science can't really test or explain, or you have to imagine some kind of physical process that we haven't discovered yet. So while it explains a lot of the image features, it does so by stepping outside known physics.
Right. It requires a leap beyond current science. Okay, so that's the sort of high energy, maybe miraculous end of things. What about more down-to-earth, purely chemical explanations? Anything that doesn't need unknown energy sources?
Yeah, there's the Maillard reaction theory. This one is more naturalistic. It suggests the image formed through a chemical reaction between amines, which are compounds released by a decomposing body, in the vapors, and the carbohydrate layer that's naturally present on linen fibers.
A Maillard reaction. It's like when toast browns.
Exactly. It's the same basic chemical process that gives toasted bread its brown crust or seared meat its color. So the pro is that it's a well-known chemical reaction. It can create a similar yellow color. It's plausible. Chemically, body plus cloth plus time could equal reaction. But the cons are pretty significant here too, and this is where the Maillard theory really struggles. The biggest problem is explaining how this kind of vapor reaction could create an image with such incredibly high resolution and sharp detail.
Because vapors would spread out, right? Be fuzzy.
Precisely. You'd expect a much softer, more diffused image, wouldn't you? But the shroud image is remarkably sharp in places. And maybe even more importantly, the critical insight here is that the Maillard reaction theory just cannot explain how the image encodes that precise 3D information, where the darkness relates directly to distance. A simple chemical vapor reaction just doesn't do that. It can make color, sure, but not the specific structured kind of image we see on the shroud.
Okay, so the natural chemical theory struggles with the detail and the 3D aspect. So if these natural or even exotic energy theories have issues, what about the most common skeptical view? It's just a clever medieval fake. What are the specific forgery ideas, and how do they stack up against all this weird science we just talked about? Like, couldn't artists just have painted it very cleverly?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And yes, medieval forgery theories have been looked at very closely, but they keep running into these major scientific roadblocks when you compare them to the shroud's actual properties. The most obvious one, painting or staining, is pretty much dismissed by most researchers now, for the reasons we've discussed. Stirp found virtually no pigment to form the image. There's no sign of capillarity, no liquid soaking into the fibers like paint would. And critically, under high magnification, you just don't see any brushstrokes. Nothing convincing. If someone painted it, even with something really diluted, you'd expect some trace of the artist's hand, some sign of the medium sinking in, maybe residues of whatever bound the pigment, but those just aren't there. The image really seems part of the fibers, not something sitting on top. Then there's the bas-relief rubbing idea. This suggests maybe a medieval artist carved a statue or a shallow relief of a body, maybe heated it up, laid the cloth over it, and then gently scorched it, or used some chemical to transfer the image.
Like brass rubbing.
Kind of, yeah. And while that technique can make a superficial image, all the experiments trying to replicate the shroud this way have basically failed to match its unique properties. It's incredibly hard to get that level of fine detail, especially across the different heights of a body, and it's even harder to avoid leaving directional marks. A rubbing inherently involves pressure and friction, right? That would leave traces, maybe compress the fibers. You don't see that on the shroud. Plus, getting the negative properties, and especially that encoded 3D information using a rubbing, nobody's shown how that could possibly work. Finally, there's the more sort of out there idea of proto-photography. that maybe some medieval genius used a camera obscura, like a pinhole camera, and some light-sensitive chemicals on the cloth.
Wow, like a medieval photograph.
Sounds cool, right? But it hits a massive historical wall. There's just zero evidence that anyone in the 14th century had the technology, the camera obscura capable of projecting such a detailed image, and the chemical knowledge to make linen light sensitive and then fix the image permanently so it wouldn't fade. That's centuries ahead of its time. It would require a Da Vinci-level genius working totally in secret, leaving no trace. So yeah, wrapping up this section, the really fascinating thing is that right now, today, no proposed method, natural or artificial, has managed to successfully replicate all the known physical and chemical properties of the shroud image at the same time. That remains the biggest hurdle for any forgery theory. Scientifically, it's still an image we can't fully explain, a true enigma of image formation.
That really does set the stage. It's not just a picture, it's a scientific puzzle box.
Okay.
But okay, let's shift gears a bit. Beyond how the image got there, what about what it shows? Because the medical and forensic information it contains is, well, it's astonishing. It's not just a vague shape. It's an incredibly detailed, anatomically precise picture of a body that went through horrific torture and crucifixion.
Absolutely. The medical and forensic details on the shroud are truly remarkable, especially the anatomical correctness, considering it comes from a time centuries before modern medical understanding. The image shows a man probably between 5'10" and 6'0" tall, pretty muscular build, suggesting someone used to physical labor or exertion, who then underwent extreme physical trauma. Let's zoom in on the nail wounds, because they tell a fascinating story. The visible wound in the wrist area, it's not in the palm, which is how almost all medieval art showed it.
Right, artists always put it in the palm.
Always. But on the shroud, the wound is precisely in what anatomists call Desstot's space. It's a small area in the wrist, between the carpal bones, and this is anatomically crucial. Why? Because a nail through the palm just can't support a body's weight on a cross. The flesh would tear right through. But a nail going through Desstot's space in the wrist, that's a solid anchor point. It can hold the weight. And horrifically, it would also pierce or damage the median nerve, causing unbelievable pain and forcing the thumb to clench tightly into the palm.
Which is why you don't see the thumbs on the shroud image.
Exactly. That detail, the hidden thumbs, is a direct consequence of the wrist wound described. Now think about a medieval forger. Would they know this anatomy? Would they deliberately contradict centuries of religious art tradition to depict a wrist wound instead of a palm wound? It seems highly unlikely. This anatomical accuracy is a major point for proponents of authenticity.
Okay, so the nail wound is anatomically correct in a way an artist back then probably wouldn't know or depict. What about the crown of thorns? Art shows that as a simple ring, usually.
Right, like a circlet. But the shroud shows something much more brutal. The wounds cover the entire scalp, forehead, top, back of the head. It suggests a helmet or cap made of thorny branches was forced onto the head. The scalp bleeds profusely because it's incredibly vascular, tons of blood vessels. So a cap of thorns like that would cause extensive bleeding, precisely matching the pattern of blood rivulets we see flowing down the forehead and into the hair on the shroud image. Again, medically very accurate and different from typical artistic depictions.
And the scourging marks.
Oh, they are incredibly specific. The body is covered front and back, legs included, with over 100 distinct wounds. They have this characteristic dumbbell shape. Yeah, like two small balls connected by a bar. These marks are perfectly consistent with a Roman flagrum. That was a nasty whip with multiple leather thongs, each tipped with small pieces of lead or bone designed to gouge and tear the flesh. And the angles of these wounds on the shroud, they strongly suggest two scourgers, one on each side of the victim, striking the body. It's not just random marks. It's a pattern consistent with a specific, brutal Roman practice.
And the spear wound in the side.
Yes, there's a large, clear, elliptical wound on the man's right side, between the ribs. Its size and shape match what you'd expect from a Roman lanza or spear. But what's really striking forensically is the flow pattern from that wound. You see evidence of two distinct fluids having flowed out. A heavier, darker fluid consistent with blood, likely clotted, and a lighter, more watery fluid, probably pericardial or pleural fluid, the fluid surrounding the heart and lungs, or perhaps serum separating from the blood.
The blood and water from the gospel description.
Exactly. It matches the description in John 19.34 perfectly. And crucially, forensic analysis suggests this wound was inflicted after death. The way the blood and serum seem to have separated and flowed indicates the heart wasn't pumping anymore. The blood would have pooled and started to separate in the body cavities before draining out when the side was pierced.
That's an incredible level of detail. It sounds like a coroner's report almost. Beyond just the wounds, what about the blood itself? You mentioned blood flows, but is it actual blood? What can it tell us? Because claiming real human blood is huge.
It is huge, and it's a critical piece of evidence. The STIRP team, using various tests like spectroscopy and chemical analysis, confirmed the presence of hemoglobin and other blood components. They concluded definitively that the stains are real human blood.
Not just iron oxide paint made to look like blood.
No, chemically and structurally, it's consistent with actual blood. Subsequent tests, done after STIRP, have even identified the blood type as AB. Now, that's interesting because AB is relatively rare in Europe, maybe 4% of the population, but it's significantly more common in the Middle East, maybe 10–15% in some areas.
And anything else about the blood's chemistry?
Yes, another fascinating finding is the presence of high levels of bilirubin in the bloodstains. Bilirubin is a substance that forms when red blood cells break down, and levels spike significantly in cases of severe trauma, stress, or shock, exactly like someone undergoing torture and crucifixion. High bilirubin does something else interesting, too. It can cause old bloodstains to retain a more reddish color over time, instead of turning black or dark brown like blood usually does as it oxidizes. This could explain why the Shroud's bloodstains still appear reddish-brown after centuries.
And you mentioned serum rings.
Right. Forensic experts point this out. Around many of the bloodstains, you can see clearer, yellowish rings. These are serum rings. They form naturally when real blood clots and dries. The watery serum separates from the red cells and dries around the edge. You just don't get that effect with paint or pigment. It's a clear sign that these stains came from actual liquid blood drying on the cloth. And maybe the most crucial point, chronologically speaking, the image itself is not underneath the bloodstains.
Say that again? The image isn't under the blood.
Correct. Where there's a bloodstain, the characteristic yellowing of the image underneath is missing. This strongly suggests the blood was on the cloth first, and then the image formation process happened, somehow working around the existing blood clots.
Wow. How would a forger even do that? Apply blood perfectly, let it dry, and then somehow create the image right up to the edges of the blood, but not under it.
Exactly. It's an incredibly difficult, maybe impossible sequence to replicate with any known forgery technique. So if you put all this medical and forensic evidence together, the sheer volume of it, the accuracy, the details that contradict medieval knowledge and art, the confirmation of real blood with trauma markers, the serum rings, the blood before image sequence, it presents a really formidable challenge to the idea of a simple medieval forgery. It forces you to ask, how on earth could a medieval artist possess such detailed anatomical, physiological, and forensic knowledge centuries ahead of time and apply it so perfectly even when it went against everything they'd normally depict? It's a profound puzzle.
Okay, so we have this scientifically baffling image and these incredibly precise forensic details, all suggesting a real tortured human body. Now let's talk about its journey through time, because the Shroud's history seems to have, well, two very different stories. One that's clearly documented and another that's hypothesized but really compelling.
That's a perfect way to frame it. There's a real tension there. Let's start with the solid ground, the documented history. We know for sure the Shroud pops up definitively in Lire, France, around 1355. It's owned by a knight, Geoffrey de Charny, quite a famous figure back then, and right from the start, its exhibition caused a stir. It wasn't just accepted unquestioningly. People clearly found it unusual.
And wasn't there a bishop who called it a fake pretty early on?
Yes, that's a key piece of the historical puzzle. Bishop Pierre d'Arces wrote a memorandum to the Pope Clement VII in 1389, and he did not mince words. He called it a forgery, said it was cunningly painted, man-made. He even claimed his predecessor, another bishop, had investigated and actually found the artist who made it.
Wow, so a direct accusation of forgery from a bishop at the time.
A very direct accusation, yes. That's a crucial historical counter-argument for skeptics. Anyway, after the de Charny family, the Shroud eventually passed to the House of Savoy in 1453. They kept it for centuries, moving it to Turin, Italy, in 1578, hence the name Shroud of Turin. It stayed with the Savoys until 1983, when the last king of Italy, Umberto II, bequeathed it to the Holy See, the Vatican. So the Vatican owns it now, though it stays in Turin. That's the clear, documented chain of custody from the mid-14th century onwards.
Okay, that's the confirmed history. But for people who think it's much older, there's this whole other narrative, right? Trying to fill that big gap before 1350. What's that hypothesized story look like? How do they connect it way back to ancient times?
Right. Proponents of authenticity have pieced together a plausible, though, we have to stress, unproven earlier history. The main theory connects the Shroud to a famous, almost legendary relic called the Mandylion of Edessa.
The Mandylion. That was just a face cloth, wasn't it?
Well, that's often the assumption, but maybe not. The Mandylion was hugely important in early Christianity. It was believed to be a cloth bearing the miraculous image of Jesus' face, not made by human hands. We know it was venerated in Edessa, that's modern Urfa in Turkey, from at least the 6th century. Then, historical records show it being transferred with great ceremony to Constantinople, the Byzantine capital, in 944 AD. It became like the crown jewel of the city's relics. Now here's where it gets interesting. Some Byzantine descriptions of the Mandylion refer to it as tetradiplon. That means doubled in 4. It suggests it wasn't just a small face cloth, but actually a larger cloth that was folded up carefully so that only the face was visible.
Folded in 4. And does the shroud show signs of folding like that?
Amazingly, yes. Modern analysis of the shroud has identified specific crease patterns on the linen, and these patterns are consistent with it having been folded repeatedly in exactly that way, doubled 4 times to display just the facial area. So there's a physical link, potentially, between the shroud's current state and these old descriptions of the Mandylion. So the theory continues. The Mandylion was in Constantinople until 1204. That year, the Fourth Crusade happened, and the Western Crusaders infamously sacked the city. During that chaos, the Mandylion disappeared from the historical record.
Vanished.
And that leaves a gap of about 150 years until, guess what reappears in France?
A shroud with Geoffrey de Charny.
Exactly. And adding another layer, it turns out an ancestor of Geoffrey de Charny, a guy named Othon de la Roche, was actually a prominent crusader who was in Constantinople during the sack of 1204.
Ah, so a possible, though unproven way it could have gotten from Constantinople to the de Charny family in France.
It provides a potential pathway, yeah. The idea is it was looted or smuggled out during the Crusade chaos, kept hidden perhaps, and eventually ended up with the de Charny family generations later.
Okay, so the Mandylion theory tries to bridge the gap. But is there any actual evidence supporting an earlier history? Something more concrete than just connecting dots between the Mandylion and the shroud? Something from before the 1350s?
Yes, there are a couple of really intriguing pieces of evidence that proponents point to, things that are hard to explain if it's just a 14th century fake. One of the strongest is the Prey manuscript.
Prey manuscript.
It's a Hungarian illustrated manuscript, a codex, dated to between 1192 and 1195 AD. Now, why is this timing critical?
Because that's before 1204 when the Mandylion vanished, before it showed up in France, and crucially, before the carbon-14 date range.
Exactly. Predates the C14 date significantly. Now, this manuscript has an illustration of Jesus' burial, and in this picture, the body is shown naked, unusual for the time. His hands are crossed over the pelvis, just like the figure on the shroud. Even more specific, one hand in the drawing clearly shows only 4 fingers, with the thumb hidden. That's that peculiar detail we talked about, likely caused by the wrist nail wound. Seeing that exact, very specific detail in a manuscript from the 1190s is, well, it's striking.
Wow. That is specific.
But wait, there's more. The burial cloth, depicted in that same Prey manuscript illustration, has a pattern of small burn holes drawn on it. They're in a distinct L-shaped pattern.
Burn holes.
Yes. And remarkably, this pattern of L-shaped burn holes precisely matches a set of actual burn holes that exist on the real Shroud of Turin today, damage believed to have happened during a fire in 1532.
Wait. The drawing from the 1190s shows burn holes that match damage from a fire in the 1500s. How is that possible?
That's the mystery, unless those burn holes were already on the cloth before the Prey manuscript was drawn. It strongly suggests the artist of the Prey manuscript was looking at, or had knowledge of, the shroud as it existed then, complete with those specific burn marks long before its documented appearance in France and long before the C14 date. That's an extraordinary coincidence if the shroud was made in the 1300s.
Okay, that's genuinely weird. What else? You mentioned another cloth.
Yes, the Sudarium of Oviedo. This is a separate relic, kept in Oviedo, Spain. It's believed to be the face cloth, the sudarium, that was placed over Jesus' head after death, as mentioned in the Gospel of John. Now, the sudarium has no image, but it is heavily stained with blood and other fluids, and forensic tests on these stains also found type AB blood, same rare type as on the shroud.
Okay, same blood type. Interesting.
But it gets better. Proponents claim that the patterns of the blood stains and the pulmonary edema fluid stains on the sudarium are a perfect forensic match for the stains around the nose and mouth on the shroud image. Like they overlay perfectly in shape, size, and position.
Meaning both cloths likely covered the same face.
That's the implication, that they covered the same deceased individual's head, probably at slightly different times during the burial process. And unlike the shroud, The Sudarium of Oviedo has a documented history going back to the 7th century AD in Spain. So putting it together, while the Shroud's documented history starts in the 1350s, you have these compelling threads, the Mandylion connection with the fold patterns, the incredibly specific details in the Prey manuscript predating the C14 day, and the forensic match with the much older Sudarium, all pointing towards a history stretching back centuries earlier, linking it potentially to the very beginnings of Christianity. It creates this deep historical tension. These clues aren't easily brushed aside.
Okay, so we've got an image science still can't fully explain. We've got medical accuracy that seems way ahead of its time. And we've got this split historical narrative, documented as medieval, but with these tantalizing clues pointing much further back. So how does this all crash together in the big debate about authenticity? This is where that paradox really hits home, right? Where hard science and history seem to tell conflicting stories.
This is exactly where it all comes to a head. It's a fascinating collision. Let's try and summarize the main arguments for authenticity, pulling from everything we've discussed. Argument 1, the unreproducible image. We've hammered this point, but it's central. Nobody, using medieval or modern techniques, has managed to create a forgery with all the Shroud's unique features. The extreme superficiality, the 3D data, the lack of directionality, the absence of pigment. This is the single biggest stumbling block for the forgery theory. If it was forged, how? The method remains unknown, maybe even unknowable.
Okay, the image itself is point 1.
Point 2, the medical and forensic accuracy. It's just astonishing. The precision of the crucifixion details the wrist wound in desktop space contradicting art and medieval knowledge, the cap of thorns, the flagrum marks, the post-mortem spear wound with blood and serum separation, all pointing to a real, brutally crucified man. It's incredibly hard to imagine a medieval forger having this level of knowledge and applying it so flawlessly. Point 3, the blood evidence. It's confirmed as real human blood, type AB, rarer in Europe, commoner in the Middle East, high bilirubin indicating severe trauma. You've got the serum rings proving it was liquid blood drying naturally, and critically, the image not being under the blood stains suggesting blood first, then image. These are tough details to fake convincingly. And point 4, the supporting historical evidence, even if not definitive proof, the links to the Mandylion, the stunning similarities in the pre-C14 Prey manuscript, thumb, burn marks, and the forensic match with the ancient Sudarium of Oviedo. They collectively build a strong circumstantial case for a pre-medieval history.
Okay, so those are 4 really strong pillars for the authenticity argument, based on science, medicine, and these historical clues. But then comes the counterpunch. The big one. What's the skeptic's absolute silver bullet that makes so many say, nope, despite all that, it has to be medieval?
You've got it. There is one piece of evidence that, for many scientists and skeptics, overrides everything else. The 1988 carbon-14 dating.
The C14.
The C14 date. In 88, 3 top-tier independent labs, Oxford, Zurich, Arizona, got small samples snipped from the Shroud. They all used radiocarbon dating, the standard scientific method for dating organic stuff. And all 3 labs, working completely independently, came back with remarkably consistent results. They dated the linen of the sample to between 1260 and 1390 AD. With about 95% confidence.
Which is smack dab in the middle of the medieval period when it first showed up in France.
Exactly, right in the era of Geoffrey de Charny. For many, this is scientifically robust, rigorously done, game over. It proves the cloth itself originated in the Middle Ages, therefore it must be a medieval artifact. End of story.
So that's the primary argument against authenticity. What else supports the medieval view?
Well, there's the historical gap we talked about. As intriguing as the Mandylion theory is, there's still no unbroken, documented chain of custody before 1355. It remains a hypothesis connecting circumstantial dots, not solid proof, tracing the Shroud back through Edessa and Constantinople. And then there's Bishop Darcis's memorandum from 1389. That's a direct historical document from someone on the scene, explicitly calling it a fake, a painting, and even claiming the artist was known. You can't just ignore a contemporary accusation like that from a church official.
Right. So C14 date, historical gap, the bishop's letter. What about that idea that the C14 sample itself was flawed? The repair theory.
Ah, yes, the invisible reweaving or repair hypothesis. This is the main counter-argument to the C14 dating, put forward by some Shroud proponents. The argument is that the tiny sample cut for dating wasn't representative of the original Shroud linen. They suggest it came from a corner area that had been damaged, maybe by fire, and then expertly repaired in the medieval period. The idea is that skilled nuns, perhaps, used a technique called French invisible reweaving to interweave newer linen threads, and maybe even some cotton threads, with the original linen to fix the damage.
So the sample would be a mix of old and new material.
Potentially, yes. And if the sample contained a significant amount of younger 16th century thread mixed with older, potentially 1st century thread, it would skew the radiocarbon date, making the whole thing appear medieval. Now, some researchers have published studies looking at the threads from the sample area under microscopes, claiming they see evidence of splicing, different thread types, maybe dye coatings, consistent with trying to match colors evidence supporting this repair idea.
But is that accepted?
It's highly debated, very controversial. Other scientists, including some involved in the original dating, strongly dispute these findings. They argue there's no convincing evidence of a significant, systematic reweave in that area, or that any minor contamination wouldn't be enough to shift the date by over 1,200 years. They stand by the original C14 results as robust. So the invisible reweaving hypothesis hasn't been universally accepted by the broader scientific community. It remains a plausible explanation for some, questioning the C14 result, while for others, it's seen as an unproven ad hoc attempt to dismiss inconvenient data. The debate over the sample's integrity is definitely ongoing.
Okay, so where does that leave us? What does this all actually mean? We seem to be stuck in this incredible bind where hard science points one way, other hard science points another, history is split. It feels like a genuine, maybe even unsolvable paradox.
I think profound paradox is exactly the right term. That's the current state of play with the Shroud of Turin. Probably one of the starkest examples we have of different, reliable forms of inquiry yielding apparently contradictory results. You've got hard science radiocarbon dating pointing squarely to a medieval origin, 1260, 1390 AD. A reliable method, clear result. Then you have other hard science, the physics and chemistry of the image itself, pointing to something unexplainable, unreproducible by any known natural or artificial means, medieval or modern. Its properties just don't fit. Then medical and forensic science point strongly towards a real, tortured, crucified human body, depicted with an accuracy that seems impossible for the medieval period. And finally, history, which is clearly documented from the mid-14th century, but has these persistent, plausible, though unproven, tendrils reaching back centuries earlier via the Mandylion, the pre-manuscript, the Sudarium. The Shroud remains this enduring enigma precisely because the two sides can't fully answer the other's main point. Detractors, holding up the C14 date, cannot convincingly explain how such a unique image with all its bizarre properties could possibly have been faked in the Middle Ages. And proponents, pointing to the image's scientific uniqueness and medical accuracy, cannot definitively refute the C14 date in a way that satisfies the broader scientific community. That's the core dilemma. That's why the debate rages on. So you, the listener, are left with this fascinating choice, this real puzzle to think about. Is it the authentic burial cloth of Jesus from the 1st century marked by some event, perhaps miraculous, that defies our current science? Or is it a medieval artifact, but one of such incredible, baffling genius both artistically and technically that its creation is almost a miracle in itself, something we still can't figure out how to replicate? What stands out most to you in this whole tangled story? Which piece of this contradictory evidence feels most compelling or most problematic? It's a question that continues to resonate.
What a question to leave us with. It really highlights the complexity, doesn't it? Thank you for joining us on this really deep dive into one of history's most fascinating and honestly frustrating artifacts. It really makes you think about evidence, belief, and the limits of what we know.
Absolutely. And I hope it encourages everyone listening to maybe read more, to continue exploring the Shroud's mysteries for themselves. It truly sits at this amazing crossroads of science, history, faith, and doubt.
Definitely. And if you have topics or sources you'd like us to tackle in a future deep dive, please do let us know. We love hearing your ideas. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep getting well informed.